Mr. President.
Senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank my colleague from the state of Washington for his detailed and lengthy and compelling remarks on the floor this morning about why he will vote against Betsy DeVos for Secretary of Education for the United States. And you've heard from my colleagues last night, this morning, for an entire day, the concerns that they've come away from her confirmation hearing with, the concerns they've heard from their home state and from educators and parents, teachers and administrators, all concerned about education in their home states. And I am honored to have a chance to add my few brief words this morning to explain to my constituents and to everyone in this chamber why I, too, believe that Betsy DeVos is not qualified to serve as Secretary of Education of the United States. Mr. President, a simple question for any parent out there is, why would a parent want a classroom teacher who wasn't qualified to stand before that class and teach their children? Why would any community leader, civic leader, parent, educator want a principal who wasn't qualified to lead the school building and to lead instruction and to make sure that the school was moving forward in a good and positive way? The answer is they wouldn't. Why would any parent, why would any business leader, why would any legislator want a superintendent for a school district who had no previous experience in public education and whose agenda was well outside the mainstream in education? The answer is they wouldn't. And so I think the question before us as a Senate today is, why would any of us want, support, vote for a nominee to be Secretary of Education whose demonstrated lack of grasp of the basics of education makes her obviously unqualified? The answer is, I don't. We don't. We shouldn't. As we saw during her abbreviated Senate hearing, Ms. DeVos has no grasp of basic public education issues. She has zero direct experience. She hasn't taught in the public schools. She hasn't sent her kids to public schools. She hasn't been educated or trained in teaching in the public schools. She doesn't seem to understand, for example, that federal law provides basic protections for students with disabilities. She has no idea what the IDEA is and why it is a central part of protecting and supporting and serving students with intellectual disabilities. She refused to rule out privatizing public schools and refused to commit to enforcing federal laws that protect women and girls in schools from sexual assault. But that's not all. As if that weren't enough, Betsy DeVos has spent her entire career and millions, even tens of millions of dollars, methodically undermining the public school system in the United States. From privatizing and defunding public education to undermining accountability standards in Michigan and across the country, Betsy DeVos has turned Michigan into the biggest school choice experiment in the nation. And unfortunately for Michigan students and families, that experiment has gone terribly wrong. There's a lot of talk in education circles about two key issues: access and accountability. And what is stunning about Betsy DeVos's record in Michigan is that she worked tirelessly to ensure access to taxpayer dollars for the widest possible range of private and parochial schools, charters, and through vouchers, schools of all type, academies newly established to take advantage of taxpayer dollars and to siphon them into non-traditional or non-public schools. But without accountability. Without accountability, charters and choice can lead to tragic results, can literally lead to siphoning desperately needed dollars out of our public schools and into the pockets of those who would profit from experiments in public education. Why would we allow access to taxpayer dollars with no accountability for the performance? And when did it become something that the other party would champion, that we would have access to taxpayer dollars without accountability for results? I understand the drive, the desire, even the passion for experimentation in public education. I spent more than 20 years working with the I Have a Dream Foundation, and we served parents and students in some of the toughest, most struggling public schools in the entire United States. And I heard from parents that they wanted better schools for their kids. And I understand that in some communities, there is a passion for experimentation with charters and with choice. But to embrace that without accountability, to ensure that the outcomes are better, without making any serious effort to ensure that these diverted taxpayer dollars are not simply wasted or turned into a mill and a machine for profit, I think is the worst sort of taking advantage of the hopes and dreams of parents and students who are seeking progress. And it ends up undermining and defunding and devaluing traditional public schools all across our country. As my colleagues, my friend from the state of Washington and many others have pointed out, there are serious concerns with how Republicans have considered her nomination. Ms. DeVos was rushed into her confirmation hearing before she'd submitted the basic and appropriate ethics paperwork, meaning senators had no way of clearing her from potential conflicts of interest. Traditionally, this hasn't been much of a concern since we've often had secretaries of education with long public careers who had been subject to some transparency and some review previously. And I can't remember a time when we had a secretary of education who was a billionaire and thus subject to much broader potential conflicts of interest. And I frankly can't remember a time when we had a president who was a billionaire and refused to release his taxes or to address his manifest conflicts of interest. So frankly, the fact that the Senate Help Committee raced forward with Ms. DeVos's confirmation without addressing some of these basic issues is more concerning in this context than at any previous time. And that the members of this committee, who represent a broad range of views and experiences, and is exactly what the Senate is for, were limited to one round of 5 minutes for questions. Hardly sufficient for any nominee, let alone a controversial nominee with no public education experience other than undermining the underpinnings of the public school system. We can only conclude that there was something behind this effort to race Ms. DeVos forward. And we've seen here on the floor, she has become so unpopular that the other party has had to delay the confirmation vote in order to ensure her confirmation. And it's my guess that later this morning we will see the President of the Senate cast a deciding vote, something that, although not unprecedented, is certainly unusual and suggests that other senators have heard from their states, as I have from mine, a chorus of opposition. In her confirmation hearing, Ms. DeVos struggled to articulate basic concepts central to current debates in public education. In trying to identify and reconcile the simple concepts of growth and proficiency, she showed neither growth nor proficiency. She showed neither a grasp of the basics, nor an ability to learn, nor a mastery of simple concepts central to how we make progress in public education. You know, here in the Senate and the Congress in recent years, after years of disagreement and fighting with the Every Student Succeeds Act, we'd reached a modicum of agreement. We'd reached a point of equilibrium and had hopefully turned to a point where we could work together in a bipartisan and balanced way on some of the pressing issues in higher education, in elementary education, in career and technical education. But instead, we see one of the more radical nominees ever for Secretary of Education, someone who brings, I am afraid, an agenda, a strong and forceful agenda, that if it is continued nationally, as it was in Michigan, I am concerned, predicts a difficult future, even for those who are most in need of support, of engagement, of quality schools, even those who Ms. DeVos claims to have dedicated her education activism to advancing, I think will be deeply harmed. None of these reasons that I just laid out about the timing, about the length of the hearing, about the disclosures, about her performance in the confirmation hearing, none of them would necessarily taken alone be cause for grave concern and alarm. But taken in combination, they are fundamentally disqualifying. But don't take my word for it. Don't take my word for it. I'm on 5 different committees. I've got lots of other confirmations I am challenged to be engaged in. I've got other issues going on that have made it hard for me to attend every single meeting and hearing about Ms. DeVos. But there are folks in my home state of Delaware who have watched every minute, who have followed it very closely, and who have, in an unprecedented wave of input, reached out to my office. Now, these numbers, if I were from a state like California or Texas or New York, might not seem striking, but from my little state of 900,000 constituents, the idea that more than 3,000 Delawareans have reached out to me urgently and directly is fairly striking. I've gotten more than 450 phone calls in opposition to Ms. DeVos. My office in Wilmington received a signed petition with 800 signatures from Delawareans asking me, urging me to vote no. Someone buttonholed me literally on the train this morning to make certain that I was going to vote no. And I've received more than 2,200 letters from Delawareans, letters from educators, from parents, from community and civic leaders of all different backgrounds, all up and down my state. And those 2,200 letters makes this one of the top issues that Delawareans have reached out to me on in this past year. As I said, that may not sound like a lot of input. If I were from California, New York, Oklahoma, Washington State, 3,000 would be relatively few. But in my state, that is a loud and clear message. And so let me be just as loud and clear in my reply. I hear you, and I will today vote against Betsy DeVos for Secretary of Education. Let me take a minute and share with you some of the concerns I've heard from Delawareans constituents who followed her confirmation hearing closely, who followed the record of its progress from committee to floor closely, and who raised the alarm and who've shared that with me. One educator, a career teacher, somebody who is very agitated about the record she showed in Michigan and what it might mean for our state in Delaware, said concisely, "Why should we welcome a billionaire president who nominates a billionaire friend, who sees children not so much as children to be educated and supported and served, but as tokens to be used as an experiment in privatization and profit made off our public school system?" That educator said he was terrified. Jen, a middle school teacher at Reading Middle School in Appoquinimink School District, tells me that her first thought, and I quote, after watching Ms. DeVos' Senate hearing closely, was that students deserve better than her. Jen goes on to say that students deserve a national leader in education who has real experience working in public schools, someone who knows the strengths and challenges that each student brings to the classroom. Jen said, as a teacher, I need someone who will fight for all students, low income, gifted, talented, and especially our students with disabilities. Jen said, I work in a classroom filled with students like these, students of every background and skill level and need, and they deserve someone better. Sherry wrote to me from Lewis, Delaware. She's a retired lifetime educator and district supervisor and coordinator. And just a few years ago, she retired to Lewis after spending her life advancing public education. And she wrote that until now, she, quote, never felt it necessary to write my senators to oppose a presidential nomination. But here's why this time is different. And as Sherry writes, Betsy DeVos is a proponent of school vouchers which siphon dollars off from public schools. She does not have a degree in education. She has no experience in public education and hasn't shown a willingness to listen to and learn from practitioners and experts in the field. Mr. President, Sherry is exactly right. Our kids deserve better. That's why, Mr. President, when it comes to Betsy DeVos' nomination to serve as Secretary of Education, I'm not just voting no, I'm voting no way. And it is important to me that everybody here know that my constituents in my state have spoken with nearly a unanimous voice. A very, very few have conveyed any support whatsoever for Ms. DeVos, and an overwhelming voice of thousands have expressed concern, agitation, even alarm at the idea that this person with this record would be handed the reins of the federal Department of Education with likely disastrous results for this most foundational experiment that is at the core of American democracy, that is essential to our being a country where equality of opportunity, the freedom to pursue our own skills and gifts and have them enlightened, educated, uplifted, is at the very core of what it means to be American. Public schools in which any child of any background has a free and fair opportunity to pursue their God-given talents and to rise through our society and contribute at the highest levels isn't something to be played with, isn't something to be experimented with casually, is something to be taken deeply seriously We have challenges in our public schools. We have challenges in our society, and they're reflected in our schools. But if our schools are not strong, if our schools are not educating our children, we have no hope of becoming a more just, a more equal, a more constructive, a more coherent, and a more inspiring society. Our public schools are at the very foundation of what it means to be America. And to put in charge of our Department of Education someone who doesn't share that view pains me deeply, concerns my constituents, and alarms many of us who have spent year after year trying to support, to improve, and to advance public education in the United States. For all these reasons, Mr. President, it is my intention to vote no, in fact, no way, today on Ms. DeVos. And with that, I yield the floor.